She was definitely a psychopath. She didn't care who you were. If you were in her way, she would find a way to get rid of you. Hey guys, welcome back. If you are new here, hi, my name is Shayna, and in my little corner of the internet, we talk about spooky history of all kinds. And if that sounds like something you're interested in, be sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell because I'm here for you on Wednesdays. I also have a podcast called Spooky History with Shayna Blake, and that is where the audio of this video will be. So if that's more your thing, I'll have a link down in the description for you. Now today's video is one that I heard from the Lore podcast by Aaron Mahnke, and we will be talking about the famous Jolly Jane. Now, Jane was born as Honora Kelly around 1857 in Boston and was the youngest of 4 girls. She was born into a very poor Irish immigrant family. When she was only a year old, her mother would die of tuberculosis. Her father, Peter Kelly, was a tailor who would eventually lose his mind, and it said that he would sew his eyes shut. Now, since the girls' father could no longer watch after them, a man named Kelly the Crack would be their new guardian. Now, there were rumors that went around that he was abusing these girls. I'm not sure on the details or if it's even true, but that's what was being said. So then in 1863, Kelly the Crack would take 8-year-old Delia and 6-year-old Honora to the orphanage that was called the Boston Female Asylum and was located in the city's south end. As soon as each of the girls turned 10 is when the orphanage would find them good homes. Sadly, it's said that Delia would eventually become a prostitute and an alcoholic. And then another sister, Nellie, would end up in an insane asylum. I'm not sure what happened to the third sister though, but Honora became an indentured servant, which means she would perform some sort of labor without receiving payment. She was a servant to a Mrs. Anne C. Toppin of Lowell, Massachusetts. It's believed that the Toppins treated Honora pretty well, and the Toppins would tell their peers that Honora was an Italian girl whose parents died at sea. Now they did this because of a stigma associated with the Irish at the time. The Irish were receiving a lot of hate. They were blamed for spreading disease and were also blamed for any unsanitary conditions. So because of this, the Toppin family would change Honora's name to Jane Toppin to help her sound a little less Irish. Not sure who they were trying to protect when they did this, either Jane or themselves. Who knows? Now Jane was very bright. She did pretty well in school. It wouldn't be until she got a little older that she would start to display signs of sociopathic behavior. She would tell these really outrageous lies. Here's an example of one of her crazy lies. She would say stuff like her father sailed around the world and that her sister married an English nobleman, and her brother, which she didn't even have a brother, was decorated at Gettysburg by Abraham Lincoln. So I'm assuming that given her situation, it was also she could get attention. She probably wanted to make her life sound like it was glamorous and perfect when it was really the complete opposite. It's kind of sad. Then at the age of 18, Jane would graduate from Lowell High School. Now this is when the Toppin family would release Jane from her indenture contract and would give her $50, which back then would have been about $1,000 in today's money. I thought that was pretty generous of them. And she was now free to do whatever she wanted. But what she really wanted was to stay in the Toppin home as a live-in household servant. She probably had it really good there, or else she would have left, is my assumption. Anywho, Anne Toppin would eventually pass away, and her daughter Elizabeth would take over the home. Now, it's said that Elizabeth and Jane were pretty good friends. They got along okay. So Elizabeth decided to keep Jane on as a servant. But Elizabeth would end up getting married to a church deacon whose name was Oramel Brigham, and Oramel would end up moving into the Toppin home. Now, I'm not sure what happened, but there was some sort of dispute, and it caused Jane to move out of the home she's loved for the last 20 years. Now, I'm sure that was hard for her to do, but she would bounce back from this. And at the age of 33, Jane would start training as a nurse in Cambridge Hospital in 1887. Now, this is a hospital where she would earn the nickname Jolly Jane, and that's because she was known to have a very friendly and outgoing personality. Many of her patients and doctors just loved her, but her fellow students would grow to despise her. She would continue to make up her outrageous lies, such as saying stuff like Tsar of Russia had offered her a nursing job, but she decided not to take it. Honestly, who's gonna believe you turned down a job like that, right? It's also said that she loved to gossip a lot. Also, while working at the hospital, they would start to notice that Jane had a strange fascination with autopsies and that this fascination would turn into an obsession. But what neither the hospital nor her co-workers knew about was that Jane was starting to experiment with morphine and atropine on her elderly patients, essentially using them as her guinea pigs. She would first sedate them, then administer drugs to re-stimulate their adrenaline. And for someone who has had pretty much zero control of her life, I'm sure this made her feel like she could do anything. She loved the feeling of being in control of others' lives, and she became addicted to it. After she had her fun with the patients, she would give them a fatal dose of morphine and would watch them as they slowly died. There was this one patient whose name was Amelia Feeney. She had an operation in 1887, and while she was in recovery, she would go to say that Jane came into her room and gave her a dose of very bitter medicine, which caused Amelia to start to lose consciousness. She would still remain awake, but she was really groggy, and she explained that Jane climbed into her bed and kissed her all over her face. But something had startled Jane, and she immediately stopped and left the room. The next morning, Amelia just chalked it down to being a very strange dream. Now, it wouldn't be until 14 years later, after Jane was arrested, that Amelia would realize that what had happened to her was real. So that must have been a truly terrible feeling for Amelia. I honestly couldn't imagine. Now, after Jane had finished her nursing training, she would end up getting a job at Massachusetts General Hospital, but she would eventually get caught recklessly giving patients opiates, and she would be fired for this. But for some reason, the doctors that she worked under would continue to recommend her as a private nurse to their wealthy clients. And really, come to think of it, maybe that's why they would recommend her, is because the doctors maybe had a feeling that she had no morals, and she would give these wealthy people whatever they asked for, maybe. Supposedly the rich and famous people are rumored to get whatever meds they want. I don't know. It could totally not be true, just my opinion. But anyways, Jane was said to have different personalities. When she wasn't working, she was known to drink tons of beer and would tell dirty jokes and gossip, and she thought it was really fun to turn her friends against each other. And there's that sense of control she loved so much. Then, on the other hand, when she was working, she seemed like a highly skilled professional and was always very cheerful around doctors and patients. Jane would get paid really well for being a nurse. She would earn $25 a week, which was a lot back then because the average working woman would only bring home about $5 a week. So she was making close to $700 in today's money weekly. Now, Jane was not a fan of elderly people. Her coworkers would remember her making these comments about how there's no use keeping old people alive. And honestly, I'm sure the older people were the easiest to kill, because when you hear of an older person passing away, what usually comes to mind is, natural causes. So no one would really question it. You know what I mean? Well, in 1889, a 70-year-old woman named Mary McClear would fall ill while visiting Cambridge. Her doctor would send Jane over to her home, reassuring Mary that Jane was, and I quote, "one of my best nurses," end quote. And Jane would end up murdering her by poisoning her. I wonder if that doctor ever regretted that once he found out what type of person she was. She essentially had no emotional attachment. She just had no remorse whatsoever. And if she wanted something, she took it. If someone got in her way, she would kill them. Here's an instance. Jane had a close friend that she worked with. Well, both of them wanted the job as a dining hall matron at St. John's Theological School in Cambridge. Well, Jane really wanted it. So she murdered her friend using strychnine. Jane would end up getting the job, but it was all a waste because there were so many complaints of Jane's incompetence and money would end up missing while Jane was working. So they ended up letting her go. So honestly, what was the point in that, Jane? Complete waste of time. And she lost a friend, which I'm sure she didn't have many of. So anyways, now Elizabeth, who was Jane's foster sister, her and Jane would still talk every now and then by exchanging letters. Elizabeth would offer Jane to come and visit every now and then, and sometimes Jane would take her up on that offer. Well, in the summer of 1899, Jane was vacationing in Buzzards Bay, and at this time, Elizabeth was suffering from depression. And Jane knew this, so she invited her to come and stay down with her at the Cape, as to kind of get away from it all, and Elizabeth really liked the idea, so she decided to go for a visit. And one day, Jane decided she was going to take Elizabeth to the beach for a picnic. So she packed their picnic basket with cold corned beef, taffy, and mineral water that just so happened to be laced with strychnine. Jane would later state, "I held her in my arms and watched with delight as she gasped her life out," end quote. Jane was out of control at this point. She was definitely a psychopath. She didn't care who you were. If you were in her way, she would find a way to get rid of you. And well, Elizabeth had something that Jane didn't, and that was Ormel, Elizabeth's husband. Yeah, so she killed the only sister who ever loved and cared for her because she wanted her husband. That is truly cold. So after killing Elizabeth, Jane would push herself into her old home because, like I said, she wanted Ormel Brigham. It only took Jane 3 days to kill off Ormel's housekeeper, who was a 77-year-old woman named Edna Bannister. And she did this because she wanted to impress him with her housekeeping skills. Because every man loves a woman that can scrub a toilet really well. And well, Ormel made it very clear to Jane that he didn't want her as a housekeeper or his wife. She, I guess, did not understand that he was grieving his wife and now housekeeper. She was very impatient. So after plan A failed, she went with plan B, which was to poison him and then nurse him back to health. That would make him love her, right? Her showing off her skills on how well she could take care of a person, that's gotta be a turn on, right? Well, unfortunately for Jane, that didn't work either. So she decided to threaten him to stay with her, as a last resort. She threatened him saying that she would tell everyone that he had gotten her pregnant. Well, this enraged Ormel. He had enough. So he decided to kick her out of his house, which is honestly what probably saved his life. After this, Jane felt like there was no reason to live, so she tried to overdose on morphine. For some reason it didn't work, or she just decided she wanted to live. So she went to the hospital instead and would be nursed back to health and would be released, and Jane was back to her old conniving self. Then in 1901, a friend of Jane, Maddie Davis, decided to come and visit Jane while she was in Cambridge. But for some reason, Jane decided that Maddie needed to die, so she made up a cocktail of morphine and atropine and gave it to Maddie. And sadly, Maddie would go back home to Cape Cod in a casket, dead from suspected heart failure. And for some reason, unknown to anyone who has a lick of common sense, Jane would end up speaking at Maddie's funeral. Well, apparently, the Davis family was very moved by her speech, and they asked her to stay with them as a live-in nurse. And Jane, of course, happily accepted this offer. But it would only take a month of her living with them, and she would end up killing Alden, who was Maddie's husband, and his 2 married daughters, Minnie and Geraldine. Well, Minnie's father-in-law knew something wasn't right. He knew that everyone that had died were in great health. Then this random nurse comes in, and a month later, they're all dead. So rightly so, he suspected foul play and consulted with a toxicologist and also got a judge to order Minnie's body to be exhumed. Now, when they did this, they revealed that Minnie died of morphine and atropine poisoning. So, good for the father-in-law for speaking up, because I feel like if it wasn't for him, she could have just just kept on killing, you know? And while all this was being done and the investigation was going on, Jane was visiting an old friend in Amherst, New Hampshire. So the police found out and they went and arrested her on October 29th of 1901. She would go to trial for murder in the summer of 1902. And that is when she would shock everyone and would end up confessing to her lawyer that she killed at least 31 people. But the police knew that she had to have killed between 70 to 100 people. Jane claimed that her life goal was to, and I quote, have killed more people, helpless people, than any other man or woman who ever lived. End quote. She would also claim that it wasn't her fault, you know, being a murderer and all. It's not her fault. The only reason she started killing people, according to her, was because her boyfriend dumped her when she was 16. She would go to state, "If I had been a married woman, I probably would not have killed all of those people. I would have had my husband, my children, and my home to take up my mind." End quote. So because she wasn't married and had no kids, she had no choice but to just kill people. Yeah, that makes sense. Now the trial would take 8 hours in Barnstable County Courthouse. The jury would only deliberate for 27 minutes and found Jane Toppin not guilty by reason of insanity. And she would spend the rest of her life at Taunton State Hospital, which back then, state hospitals, supposedly, not all of them, I'm sure, were probably worse than the prisons, but who knows. Now, the attendants that looked after her would say they remembered her calling them into her room, and Jane would tell them, and I quote, "Get some morphine, dearie, and we'll go out into the ward. You and I will have a lot of fun seeing them die." End quote. Jane was messed up, y'all. My word. It said that she was also like always paranoid that her nurses were going to poison her, which makes sense, you know, because she poisoned all those other people. And then Jane would end up dying on August 17th in 1938 at the age of 84. And that, my friends, is the terrible story of Jolly Jane. Let me know what y'all thought, or if you have any more info to add about her. She was definitely a strange and horrible human being. She didn't have a good home life in the beginning, but she did good for 20 years when she was with the Toppin family. It seemed that she had people who really cared for her, but I guess she was just too damaged mentally. So I don't know, but I thought it was a very interesting story and I'm excited to talk with you guys about it. If you did enjoy my video, be sure to give me a like and hit that subscribe button and notification bell. It does help out my channel. But anyways, I hope you guys have a very blessed day and I will see you all next week. Bye.